My sister-in-law's husband cooked a meal meant to me, but his wife ate it instead and died in front of everyone. I didn't know my life was about to split into a before and an after. If you had asked me that Sunday morning who I trusted most, I would have said my family. I would have said our weekly dinners were safe, predictable, boring even. I would have been wrong. My hands are still shaking as I write this, not because I'm afraid of what might happen next, but because I understand now how close I came to not being here at all. My name is Dana. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how a normal Sunday dinner turned into the worst night of my life. It's about my husband David, my sister-in-law Wendy, and her husband Andrew, the man who spent months smiling across the dinner table while planning my death. I didn't see it coming. That's the part that still haunts me. Not the screaming, not the sirens, not even the moment someone collapsed on the kitchen floor. It was the calm before all of it, the smell of beef stew filling the house, the clink of bowls on the table, the way Andrew insisted on serving everyone himself, like a thoughtful host, and the bowl he placed in front of me. He smiled when he did it. I took 3 bites. Just 3. That's all it took for my vision to blur, my stomach to twist, my body to quietly warn me that something was very wrong. I remember standing up, apologizing, saying I needed some air, still polite, still unaware that I had just escaped death by minutes. Through the glass door, I watched someone else reach for my bowl. I watched Andrew panic for the first time. I watched the plan unravel, and I watched the wrong person die. People think attempted murder looks dramatic. Shouting, chaos, violence. But real evil? Real evil looks like a family dinner where everyone trusts the wrong person. And by the time the truth came out, it was already too late for someone I loved. Before that Sunday, my life wasn't perfect, but it was steady in the way I used to think mattered most. I'm Dana, 34, and I've been married to David for almost 7 years. We met the unglamorous way most real adults do. At work, under fluorescent lights, drowning in emails and deadlines. We were both entry-level at an accounting firm back then. Me in operations support, him in audit. 2 exhausted people in cheap office clothes, trying to look like we knew what we were doing. David had this quiet humor that didn't demand attention. It just showed up when you needed it. On days when my brain felt like static, he could say one dry sentence and the tension would leave my shoulders like someone had untied a knot. We dated for 2 years before we got married. No grand gestures, no cinematic drama, just the kind of love that grows from consistency, from showing up, from being safe. And his family welcomed me immediately. His parents treated me like I'd always belonged, like marriage hadn't added me. It had simply revealed I was already theirs. Sunday dinners were a tradition long before I arrived. Potluck-style meals, wine, small arguments about sports or politics, and then dessert with someone pretending they weren't going to take a second slice. David's younger sister, Wendy, was friendly in a way that felt easy. She wasn't my best friend, but she never made me feel like an outsider. She was outdoorsy, always planning hikes and weekend trips, always trying to drag David into the sun. David would complain, I would laugh, and Wendy would roll her eyes like she'd been watching this dynamic for years. Then there was Andrew. Wendy started dating him about 5 years ago. They met through mutual friends in some outdoor adventure group, camping, trail runs, that kind of thing. Andrew worked as a dental hygienist, and at first, he seemed charming in a polished way. He remembered people's preferences. He asked questions that made you feel seen. The kind of person who would say, "How's your mom's knee doing?" 3 months after you mentioned one surgery once. At early family gatherings, Andrew always brought something thoughtful. A bottle of wine David's mom liked. A dessert Wendy's dad bragged about. He asked me what I disliked in food, and the next time we ate at their apartment, he made a point of leaving it out. It felt considerate. It felt like he was trying. Wendy and Andrew got married 3 years ago in a mountain lodge because they were both obsessed with the outdoors. It was actually beautiful. Pine trees, cold air, fairy lights. Wendy looked radiant. Andrew looked like he couldn't believe he'd been allowed to marry her. David kept squeezing my hand during the ceremony like he was quietly happy for his sister. His parents were thrilled. Everyone was. And for a while, Andrew slid into the family like he'd always been there. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners, photos, group chats. Nothing about him screamed danger. But now, looking back, I can see the first warning signs, the way you can see cracks in a wall, only after the whole house has already started to lean. About 18 months before everything happened, Andrew's curiosity shifted. It wasn't normal curiosity anymore. It was specific. He started asking me questions about my job, not in a how's work way, but in a how much do you make exactly way. I work in IT now, managing systems for a mid-sized company. It pays well enough that I don't worry about rent, groceries, or unexpected expenses. It's not wealth, it's stability. Andrew noticed. One night at dinner, he asked, too casually, whether my company offered good benefits. Like life insurance, he said, like it was just conversation, like it was the weather. I remember blinking, smiling politely, saying yes, most companies do. Andrew nodded, the way someone nods when a checkbox gets marked. And then he changed the subject so smoothly that I convinced myself I was overthinking it. That's what I did back then. I swallowed discomfort and called it politeness. I ignored the part of me that felt watched, because I still believed family dinners were safe. I still believed no one at that table would ever want me dead. At the time, Andrew's questions felt strange, but not alarming. That's the dangerous thing about slow-moving threats. They don't arrive with sirens. They arrive disguised as concern, as curiosity, as someone being responsible. After that first question about my benefits, Andrew started weaving money into conversations more often. Not directly, never aggressively. He talked about planning, about how young couples need to think ahead, about how unpredictable life was, about how people our age didn't take finances seriously enough. He'd bring up investment strategies at dinner, casually comparing whole life insurance to term policies while passing the breadbasket. He'd mention payout timelines the way someone might mention interest rates. Technical, neutral, detached. David and I didn't think much of it. We assumed Andrew and Wendy were trying to be more grown up. They'd been talking about buying a house instead of renting. Wendy wanted kids eventually. It all fit the narrative of a couple settling down. What didn't fit, but still didn't fully register, was how focused Andrew became on me. He paid attention to what I ate, what I drank, where I sat. About a year before everything happened, Andrew started insisting on cooking for family gatherings. He volunteered to host Sunday dinners at their place, not occasionally, consistently. And the meals changed. Before, Andrew had been an okay cook, simple food, safe food. Suddenly, he was making elaborate dishes, complicated recipes, stews, casseroles, layered meals with long prep times. Wendy joked that he'd turned into a chef overnight. What stood out wasn't just the effort, it was the control. Andrew stopped doing family-style serving. No more pots in the middle of the table, no more helping yourself. Instead, he plated everything himself in the kitchen, one bowl at a time, one plate at a time. He carried them out and placed them carefully in front of each person, like assignments. And if anyone tried to switch plates or share food, his expression would tighten, just for a second. Once, David reached over to take a bite of my chicken, and Andrew stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Oh, sorry," Andrew laughed immediately, forcing a smile. "I made Dana's a little differently. Wendy's stomach's been sensitive, so I adjusted portions." The explanation sounded reasonable, but the reaction didn't match it. There was another moment, 4 months before the dinner, that stayed with me long after. Andrew had started packing lunches for Wendy every day. He said it saved money, healthier than takeout, thoughtful husband behavior. One afternoon, Wendy forgot her lunch at home. She texted me because I was nearby and asked if I could grab it from their fridge and drop it off at her work. I did. When Wendy opened the bag, she took one sip of the soup and froze. She spit it back into the thermos, her face twisting in confusion. "That tastes wrong," she said. "Like chemical." She dumped it out immediately. Later, when Andrew came by her workplace, Wendy mentioned it casually, almost joking. Andrew didn't laugh. He got defensive, said the soup was fine, said he'd tasted it himself, suggested maybe the thermos wasn't clean. Wendy dropped it, but I noticed something after that. She stopped eating the lunches he packed for almost a week. Another time, at a family party hosted by David's parents, Andrew kept refilling my wine glass before it was empty. Every time I set it down, it was full again. When I finally switched to water because I had to drive, his smile flickered, just barely. Later that night, David mentioned Andrew had seemed tense. At the time, I brushed it off. Now I understand those moments weren't random. They were tests. Boundaries, reactions, dosages. Andrew wasn't being generous. He was experimenting. And I was the variable he cared about most. The Sunday everything fell apart started like every other one. David's parents invited all of us over for dinner, just the 6 of us. They said they wanted something quiet, casual, no big occasion, just family. When David and I arrived, Andrew was already in the kitchen. That should have been the first warning. He didn't look rushed. He looked focused, calm, almost pleased. A heavy pot sat on the stove, steam curling toward the ceiling, carrying the rich smell of beef, herbs, and vegetables. It smelled comforting in the way food does when you trust the hands that made it. Andrew turned when he heard us come in and smiled. "Dinner's almost ready," he said. "Beef stew, slow cooked." Wendy was setting the table, humming softly. David's parents were in the living room with wine, laughing about something on TV. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt off. Andrew insisted on handling the serving. One bowl for David's mom, one for his dad, one for Wendy, one for David. Then he went back into the kitchen. When he returned, he carried 2 more bowls. He placed one directly in front of me. "I made yours special," he said lightly. "Extra potatoes. I remembered you liked them." I thanked him. That's the part that makes my stomach turn now. Everyone started eating. The stew tasted incredible. Deep, rich, layered flavors. I took 3 bites. On the 4th, something in my body shifted. It wasn't pain. Not at first. It was a sudden lightheadedness, like the room tilted without moving. My vision softened at the edges. My stomach clenched hard, sharp enough to make me pause mid-breath. I put my spoon down. "I think I need some air," I said. "Probably too much coffee today." No one questioned it. Why would they? I walked out onto this back porch, the cool air hitting my face. I leaned against the railing, breathing slowly, telling myself it would pass. Through the glass door, I could see the dining table. I watched Wendy reach across the table. She grabbed my bowl. She said something. I couldn't hear it, but I could guess. A joke. A comment about me wasting good food. Andrew's reaction was instant. He stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. "No," he said, rushing toward her. But Wendy was already laughing, already lifting a large spoonful to her mouth. Andrew grabbed her arm. "Don't," he said louder now, sharper. Wendy laughed again. "Relax." She took the bite. Andrew's hands went to his head. I opened the door. Wendy's expression changed mid-chew. Her spoon clattered onto the table. She grabbed her throat. She tried to say, but the word never formed. She stood up, then collapsed sideways, her chair scraping loudly as she fell. David screamed. His father rushed forward. His mother froze, wine glass slipping from her fingers. Wendy's body hit the floor hard. She started convulsing. Her limbs jerked violently. Foam gathered at her lips. Her face went from flushed to terrifyingly pale in seconds. Someone yelled to call 911. David was already dialing. I dropped to my knees beside Wendy, turning her onto her side the way you're supposed to, my hands shaking so badly I could barely think. Andrew stood completely still. Both hands were over his mouth. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't crying. He was staring at Wendy like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it felt endless. They worked on her right there on the dining room floor. Oxygen. IV. Commands shouted in clipped voices. They loaded her onto a stretcher and rushed her out the door. And that was when Andrew ran after them. Not before. Not during. Only after they took her away. At the hospital, they took Wendy straight back. We sat in the emergency waiting room. The fluorescent lights too bright, the air too cold. Andrew paced. Back and forth, back and forth. I heard him mutter under his breath. This wasn't supposed to happen. David looked up sharply. What? Andrew blinked. I mean, she wasn't supposed to get sick. The food was fine. I cooked it carefully. A doctor came out and asked to speak to Andrew privately. They disappeared down the hallway. 20 minutes later, Andrew returned. His face was completely drained of color. The doctor followed. "I'm sorry," the doctor said quietly. There was nothing we could do. Wendy was dead. And the room went silent in a way that felt permanent. Shock doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't crash through your chest like grief in the movies. It settles in quietly, like a heavy fog, and suddenly everything feels distant, even your own body. I remember standing in the hospital hallway after the doctor said Wendy was dead. My hands clenched so tightly my fingernails left crescents in my palms. David slid down into a chair beside his mother, his face crumpling in a way I had never seen before. His father stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused, like the world had stopped making sense. Andrew didn't sit. He didn't cry. He paced. He kept repeating, "This doesn't make sense," under his breath, over and over, like if he said it enough times, reality might correct itself. I felt sick again, not the lightheaded nausea from before, but something deeper, colder. The doctor came back with questions. What had Wendy eaten? Had anyone else felt unwell? Who cooked? Who served the food? David answered most of it automatically. The stew. Andrew made it. Everyone ate it. The doctor looked around. Is anyone else experiencing symptoms? I hesitated. I felt lightheaded, I said finally, and nauseous. That's why I went outside. The room shifted. David's mother sucked in a sharp breath. Wendy ate Dana's bowl? The doctor's eyes moved to me immediately. Did you eat much of it? 3 bites, I said. My voice sounded far away. Maybe 4. He didn't hesitate. We need to examine you now. They brought me back to an exam room and drew blood. A nurse handed me a cup of activated charcoal and told me to drink it. It tasted like chalk and regret. An hour later, the doctor returned with a police officer. That's when the fog began to crack. The doctor explained it carefully, clinically. My blood work showed traces of a toxic substance. Not enough to be lethal, but enough to explain the symptoms. Enough to tell a very clear story. If you had eaten more, he said gently, you likely would not have survived. The police officer started asking questions. Who plated the food? Did anyone switch bowls? Did Andrew say anything unusual? I told him everything. How Andrew had insisted on serving, how he'd brought my bowl out separately, how he'd said mine was special, how Wendy had eaten from my bowl. The officer wrote without interrupting. Then he asked, where is Andrew now? I assumed he was still in the waiting room. He wasn't. Andrew had left the hospital. His car was gone. The officer's jaw tightened. We'll be going to his apartment, he said. We'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. Homicide, he added quietly. We're treating this as a homicide. After midnight, David and I went home. Neither of us spoke. David kept repeating, my sister is dead, like his brain hadn't caught up yet. I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, replaying the moment Andrew placed that bowl in front of me. I didn't tell David what I was thinking. That the bowl was never meant for Wendy. That Andrew hadn't panicked because someone was sick. He'd panicked because his plan had gone wrong. The police came the next day. Detectives calm, methodical. They asked me to start from the beginning. Every odd question. Every insurance comment. Every strange reaction. They asked if I'd ever had anything romantic or inappropriate with Andrew. No, I said immediately. Never. They nodded and wrote it down. Then they told us what they found in Andrew and Wendy's apartment. A locked cabinet above the fridge. A small brown bottle with no label. A toxic substance that wasn't available over the counter. Search history on Andrew's laptop that went back months. How long do poisons take to work? Undetectable toxins. Life insurance payout timelines. How soon after death can a claim be filed? There was a document saved on his desktop. Dates, notes, a trial run. The day Wendy spit out the soup. And then the final date. The date of the dinner. Next to it, one name. Mine. Andrew had planned to kill me. For money. And Wendy had died because she trusted him. The detectives said it was premeditated. They froze Andrew's accounts. Issued a warrant. Alerted neighboring states. When they left, David collapsed against me, sobbing. I don't understand, he kept saying. I don't understand. Neither did I. All I knew was that I was alive by accident, and someone I loved wasn't. Grief doesn't give you time to breathe before it starts demanding answers. The days after Wendy's death blurred together in a way that felt unreal, like I was moving through someone else's life, watching it happen from behind glass. David barely slept. He paced the apartment at night, stopping randomly like he'd forgotten what he was looking for. His parents came over every afternoon and sat with him, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in silence. No one knew what to say. There was no language for this kind of loss. And Andrew was gone. The police returned 2 days later with more information, and each detail made the truth heavier. They'd searched Andrew and Wendy's apartment with a warrant. Andrew hadn't been there. Some of his clothes were missing, but he hadn't covered his tracks very well. They found credit card statements Wendy never knew about. Nearly $40,000 in debt across multiple cards. They found emails confirming Andrew had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on Wendy 6 months earlier. Wendy had signed it, trusting him when he said it was responsible planning. The detectives were careful with their words, but the implication was clear. Andrew's first plan had likely been to kill his wife, but something had changed. Killing a spouse made you an immediate suspect. Too obvious, too risky. Killing me at a family dinner would have looked like an accident. Food poisoning. Tragic. Random. And if I died, David would inherit everything. Andrew had thought it through. The pressure started coming from places I hadn't expected. Extended family called, asking questions they didn't realize were loaded. What exactly did Dana eat? Why did Wendy take her bowl? Are you sure Andrew served them differently? Some people weren't accusing, but they weren't comforting either. David's aunt pulled me aside at the funeral and said, "You're lucky to be alive." Lucky? The word sat wrong in my chest. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like I had carried something deadly into David's family without knowing it. Andrew didn't show up to Wendy's funeral. People whispered. David's parents told everyone Andrew was too distraught to attend. They hadn't been told yet to keep details quiet while the police searched for him. 10 days after the funeral, the insurance company called. They were processing Andrew's claim. I told them to stop. I told them Wendy's death was being investigated as a homicide and Andrew was a suspect. The representative paused, then thanked me and said the payout would be frozen. Later, we found out Andrew had already tried to file the claim himself, calling from wherever he was hiding, claiming Wendy had died from accidental food poisoning. Even on the run, he was still chasing the money. That was the moment something in me hardened. This wasn't just about what almost happened to me anymore. This was about who Andrew really was. The police caught him 3 weeks later. He'd been staying at a cheap motel in another state, paying cash, avoiding his phone. But he slipped, used a credit card at a gas station. That was all it took. They arrested him 6 hours later. David didn't react when we got the call. He just nodded and said, "Okay," as if he'd been waiting for confirmation of something he already knew. Andrew was extradited back and charged with first-degree murder for Wendy and attempted first-degree murder for me. The trial started months later. I sat in the courtroom every day. I watched the prosecution lay out the evidence piece by piece. The poison, industrial grade, traced directly back to Andrew through an online marketplace and a P.O. box rented under a fake name. The search history, the planning document, the test run, the jury's faces as they processed what kind of person Andrew had been pretending to be. When it was my turn to testify, my hands shook, but my voice didn't. I told the truth. Every detail. Andrew's lawyer tried to poke holes in it, asked if I'd actually seen him poison the food, asked if I was certain the bowl was meant for me, asked if Wendy and I had ever had conflict. The questions felt desperate. The evidence didn't need my emotions to hold it up. David testified the next day. He broke down on the stand talking about Wendy, how close they'd been, how much he'd trusted Andrew. Watching my husband cry in a courtroom because of something meant to kill me changed me in a way I can't fully explain. The escalation wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the steady accumulation of truth, layer by layer, until there was no space left for denial. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I realized something else. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was changing. The lowest point didn't come during the arrest. It didn't come during the trial. It came later, after everything that could happen had already happened, and there was nothing left to do but sit with it. Wendy was buried. Andrew was in a holding cell, waiting for sentencing. The news cycle had moved on. Friends stopped checking in as often. Life cruelly kept going. That's when the weight finally hit me. I couldn't eat food I hadn't seen prepared. If David cooked, I watched his hands. If we ordered takeout, I opened containers slowly, smelling everything like my body might recognize danger before my brain did. I avoided stews entirely. Anything mixed. Anything where ingredients disappeared into each other. Restaurants made my chest tighten. I watched servers from the kitchen to the table, tracking plates like it was my job to keep myself alive. David noticed. He never commented. That almost made it worse. At night, when the apartment was quiet, the thoughts came. If I hadn't gone outside, if I'd eaten a little more. If Wendy hadn't joked and reached for my bowl, Wendy would be alive. The logic didn't matter. David told me it wasn't my fault. His parents told me it wasn't my fault. My mind didn't care. Guilt doesn't listen to reason. One evening, weeks after the trial, David's parents asked us to come over for Sunday dinner. At their house. The same house. David said no before I could answer. His mother nodded like she'd expected it. I just thought, she started, then stopped. Of course, I understand. After the call, David sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. She died eating food meant for you, he said quietly. Not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact. I felt my throat close. I know, I whispered. David rubbed his face with both hands. I keep thinking, if she hadn't trusted him, if she hadn't trusted us, if we'd noticed sooner. There was no version of this story where someone didn't die. That was the truth no one wanted to say out loud. The sentencing came 2 weeks later. Life in prison, no parole. The judge spoke about premeditation, about betrayal, about callous disregard for human life. Andrew stood there, expressionless. No remorse, no tears. When I gave my victim impact statement, I didn't yell. I told him what he'd done to David, to Wendy's parents, to the people who loved her. I told him Wendy had trusted him completely, and he'd tested poison on her body like she was disposable. Andrew looked at me the entire time. When I finished, he looked away. That night I broke. Not in public, not dramatically. I sat on the bathroom floor with my back against the tub and cried until my ribs hurt. David sat with me, silent, one hand on my shoulder, grounding me when everything else felt unstable. I don't want this to be who I am, I said between breaths. I don't want to live like I'm waiting for something terrible to happen again. David rested his forehead against mine. Then we won't. But healing didn't arrive neatly. There were days I felt almost normal, productive, functional. And then there were days when I stood in the grocery store staring at soup cans, my heart racing for no reason I could explain. I avoided mirrors because I didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked older, harder, like someone who had learned a truth she never wanted to know. That evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it brings wine to dinner. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it serves you food. And the worst part? I didn't trust myself anymore. Not my judgment. Not my instincts. Not the version of me who had sat at that table, smiling politely, believing I was safe. I didn't know how to be her again. And I didn't know if I wanted to. The turning point didn't come with a revelation. There was no new evidence, no surprise witness, no dramatic confession that changed everything. The truth was already complete. What changed was me. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. One of those days where grief doesn't announce itself. It just hums quietly in the background. David was at work. I was home alone, folding laundry that had been sitting untouched for days. I found the sweater I'd worn to that Sunday dinner. I froze. For a long moment, I just held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it. How ordinary it was. How easily it could have been the last thing I ever wore. My first instinct was to shove it back into the drawer and pretend it didn't exist. Instead, I sat down, and I let myself remember everything, without rushing past it, without pushing it away. I remembered Andrew's smile, the way he said my name, the deliberate care in his voice when he placed that bowl in front of me, and for the first time, something clicked. He didn't overpower me. He didn't outsmart me. He relied on my goodwill, my politeness, my trust, my instinct to smooth discomfort instead of questioning it. That wasn't weakness. That was humanity. Andrew hadn't won because he was smarter. He'd failed because he underestimated the one thing he couldn't control: chance, truth, and the way people eventually notice patterns. I folded the sweater carefully and put it in a box, not to erase it, but to contain it. That was the day I stopped replaying the what-ifs. Not because they stopped hurting, but because they stopped owning me. A few days later, the detective called to tell us something small but important. The insurance payout from Wendy's policy had been redirected to her parents. Andrew would never see a cent. David's parents decided to sell Wendy and Andrew's apartment. They couldn't stand the thought of it sitting empty, holding memories that no longer belonged to them. They donated Wendy's outdoor gear to her hiking group. They set up a small scholarship in her name for students studying environmental science. It didn't fix anything, but it mattered. That night, David and I talked about moving. Not running, choosing. "This house holds too much," he said quietly. "Not just for you, for me." I agreed. We weren't obligated to stay anchored to a place where trauma had staked a claim. Leaving wasn't defeat. It was self-preservation. As the move became real, packing boxes, sorting years of shared life, I noticed something else. I wasn't afraid all the time anymore. I was cautious, aware, changed, but not frozen. I could eat again, slowly, intentionally. I could sit with people without scanning their faces for danger. I could trust David without fear, because he hadn't been the one hiding anything. And one night, as we lay in bed in the half-packed apartment, David said something that stayed with me. "You know," he said softly, "you didn't just survive this, you ended it." I thought about that. Andrew's plan had depended on silence, on no one asking too many questions, on me being invisible enough to erase. Instead, I told the truth. I testified, I spoke, I didn't look away. And because of that, Andrew lost everything he thought he was entitled to. I didn't need revenge. The truth had done the work for me. That was the moment I realized I wasn't defined by what almost happened. I was defined by what didn't, by the fact that I was still here, still choosing, still living. The fallout didn't come all at once. It arrived in waves, small, unavoidable ripples that spread outward long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded. Andrew was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When the verdict was read, Andrew didn't react. No flinch, no anger, no regret. Just that same hollow stillness, like he was watching someone else's life end instead of his own. David's mother cried softly into a handkerchief. His father stared at the judge like he was trying to memorize every word. I held David's hand and kept my eyes forward. Andrew didn't deserve my attention anymore. After sentencing, things began to collapse around him in ways he could no longer manipulate. The life insurance company formally denied any claim tied to Wendy's death. The money went to her parents, as the law required. Andrew's attempt to profit from murder dissolved completely. Every account he'd opened was frozen. Every asset liquidated. Every lie exposed. The story didn't stay private. Local media covered the trial. Carefully at first, then more openly, once the confession was part of the public record. People who had once praised Andrew as thoughtful and reliable began to distance themselves. Friends vanished. Former coworkers stopped returning calls. His name became something people avoided saying out loud. David's parents sold the apartment quickly. They didn't take much from it. Most of Wendy's belongings went to donation centers or her outdoor group. The apartment itself felt contaminated by memories that no longer had a place in their future. They gave me Wendy's favorite scarf. I didn't ask for it. His mother pressed it into my hands and said, "She would have wanted you to have something that didn't hurt." That night, I folded it carefully and put it in the same box as the sweater. Some things are meant to be remembered quietly. David and I moved a month later. A different part of the city. Different streets. Different grocery store. No overlap with the life that had almost ended me. The new place was smaller, but lighter. The first night we slept there, I realized something surprising. I slept through the night. No dreams, no sudden waking, no replaying. Just rest. David noticed it too. "You were breathing differently," he said the next morning. "Like you weren't waiting anymore." That was the thing. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't waiting for Andrew to escape. I wasn't waiting for another shoe to drop. I wasn't waiting for guilt to swallow me whole. The truth had already done its damage, and its justice. People still asked questions. Some couldn't help themselves. What was he like? Did you suspect anything? How close were you to dying? I learned how to answer without reopening the wound. He was careful, I'd say. No, I didn't know. Close enough. And then I'd change the subject. I didn't owe anyone my trauma. David's parents changed too. They aged quickly in ways grief always accelerates. But they stopped asking, why? They started asking, how do we go on? They planned a memorial hike for Wendy with her adventure group. They scattered some of her ashes at her favorite trail lookout. David and I went. Standing there, looking out over something vast and unmoving, I felt a quiet sense of closure. Not because it made sense, but because it didn't need to anymore. Andrew wrote letters from prison. Not to me, to David's parents. They didn't open them. The prison chaplain eventually stopped delivering them. Some stories end whether the villain gets the last word or not. I never went back to the house where Wendy died. I never ate stew again. But I stopped checking locks 3 times before bed. I stopped flinching when someone set a plate down in front of me. The fear loosened its grip, not because it vanished, but because it no longer ruled. I left without vengeance. I left with truth. And sometimes that's the heaviest punishment of all. I used to think survival was loud, that it looked like triumph, like closure, like some dramatic moment where everything finally made sense. I know better now. Survival is quieter than that. It's waking up in a new apartment and realizing your chest doesn't tighten when you hear the kettle boil. It's eating a meal you didn't cook yourself and noticing, halfway through, that you forgot to be afraid. It's choosing not to let one man's cruelty define the shape of your future. Andrew is in prison. Wendy is gone. Those truths don't cancel each other out. They exist side by side, heavy and permanent. There's no lesson that makes them fair, no meaning that makes the loss acceptable. But there is something I learned, something I carry carefully now. Evil doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives smiling. Sometimes it brings wine. Sometimes it remembers your preferences. And that doesn't mean you were foolish for trusting it. It means you were human. I don't regret being kind. I don't regret believing in family. I don't regret sitting at that table thinking I was safe. What I regret is how often we teach people, especially women, to ignore discomfort in the name of politeness. To explain away instincts because we don't want to seem rude or dramatic. If your body tells you something is wrong, listen. If someone's attention feels calculated instead of caring, pay attention. And if a situation doesn't make sense, don't rush to make it comfortable. You don't owe anyone your silence. David and I are still rebuilding. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. Some days are heavier than others. Some memories still sting. But we're here. We're living. And that matters. Wendy deserved more time. Andrew deserved nothing he tried to take. As for me, I didn't get revenge. I got the truth. And I get to keep living. That's enough.